Chapter 2. Confidence Interval. Mrs. White's antiquated alarm clock rang out, echoing into her small apartment, which was dimly lit by the awakening morning dawn. The stillness of the apartment compounded the emptiness of the desperately lonely atmosphere. She was already up, fettering around in the kitchen, carrying out her default, lonely, daily routine of making cups of tea to pass the time while she attended to the only object of her love and affection, Monty, her cat. On hearing the alarm clock ringing, she hurried over to turn it off, always considerate of her neighbours. In her consideration to cease the noise, she had left the tap water running. It could not switch off automatically, as she had absently-minded left a teapot in the way of the tap's water stream detection beam. The water started to pool up in the sink. She was becoming more and more like an unbiased, as she paradoxically aged. Her fallible node nature was becoming more predominant with each new day as it shone through, corroding her expected routines and given known statistical quotas, creating chaotic results, ultimately resulting in unpredictability. She was far in excess of her daily stipulated and predicted kitchen water quota. She was rapidly becoming an inefficient economic node within the economic efficient society. She was already dressed, as old, lonely biased have always done, in a floral dress, with a large hat that looked decades out of place. Her expired, once attractive form replaced by an understated, modest respectability in the form of a faded light blue floral dress and a large, ludicrous straw hat. She looked odd and vulnerable in her decades out-of-place dress sense and weak, overweight posture. She took one last look at Monty with a worried expression. If only she could take Monty with her to Arcadia, to meet all the cast of the famous Arcadian soap opera, but she must be a good node and follow the law and attend the Arcadian consensus. She had even baked a cake for the cast she hoped to meet. She hurriedly put on dabs of respectable makeup and sunscreen cream. She picked up her train ticket to Arcadia that she had bought online and placed it in her old-fashioned handbag, along with her prized official letter of invitation to Arcadia. She hurried outside the apartment block and was met with a cold blast of morning air. The street was quiet and still. The cold morning air numbed her exposed body parts simultaneously. She braced herself and immediately started ruffling her jacket to protect against the cold. She made her way down the almost silent street as the sigma nodes conformed to the accepted time patterns of waking and sleeping. She hailed an electric cab, which was expensive, but due to the time and importance of the day, she would sacrifice later in the month to offset the cab fare that only beta and alphas could usually afford. She sat nervously in the back of the cab, fidgeting around to relieve the stress of such an important day, to be a guest of the state and possibly meet the stars of Arcadian. Finally, she made it to platform 10 of St. Pancras Underground Station. She hurried downstairs, where she was stopped by an underground official who looked better dressed and held a different posture than most underground workers. He asked abruptly for her ticket, yet not mentioned the destination of Arcadia. She proudly pulled out her ticket. The inspector looked at it and ushered her through. She eagerly boarded the new-looking tube train carriage. It looked slightly different from most monorails she had travelled on during her life, but she was no expert on tube trains. She had been brought up an unbiased binary. In the utopian state, therefore, was conditioned to believe tube trains were solely a node's interest, not for unbiased binaries to pry into. There was a broad spectrum of nodes on the extremely clean and modern tube train, unlike most public tube trains that were always covered in grime and intermittent graffiti. There was a broad spectrum of age, class, race, and other node variables, but she noticed quite a few biased nodes. Most unbiased nodes were not so bothered about the caste of Arcadia, she thought, forgetting that the passengers on the tube train were not there by choice. A burly-looking official, tube train inspector dressed in an unfamiliar underground uniform that was impeccably clean and pressed, blew an ear-piercing whistle. The tube train carriage door slid, then folded in towards the carriage, giving off a hydraulic steam noise as the doors closed. Airtight, hermetically sealing in the passenger nodes. The tube train started to accelerate down into the dark, ominous entrance hole of the underground tube tunnel network. She felt some anxiety as the tube train accelerated. Too extreme for comfort. The lights dimmed down a bit, and an automated voice on the intercom peacefully asked passengers not to forget to strap their seatbelts tight. After a few minutes, she and the rest of the nodes started to feel tired and lightheaded. Soon, passengers started to flail around desperately, trying to undo their seatbelts that would not unfasten. She felt nauseous and confused. She started to become very concerned, yet her only thought was of Monty, her cat. What would happen to him if? She mercifully blanked out as the air was slowly sucked out of the hermetically sealed tube train carriage, while the lack of air was commensurately being substituted with gas. Soon, all the nodes had quietly suffocated to death in their sleep. After a few moments, the tube train had transformed from a public transport system to a rolling mortuary. The nodes were now cadavers, sitting upright in their seats. Suddenly the light intensified to a high voltage, and extremely high-pitched alarm bells resonated with flashing LED lights. An electric shock pulsed and resonated through the metal tube train carriage floor, mercifully testing to analyze if any unfortunate node was still alive, in order to save them the final ordeal that lay in wait for the cadavers ridding the Arcadian Express. Then, an extreme low pressure invaded the carriages as the on-board computer dutifully dropped the carriages to an almost partial vacuum, killing any possible remnants of life. The carriage air was slowly replenished to normal atmospheric pressure, all solely done by an automated on-board computer embedded in the tube train. There were no guards or drivers on board. Eventually the tube train emerged from the underground secret tube line, far from primary sample space. It accelerated to very high speed along a specially constructed southeast coast railway track, passing through the beautiful countryside. The passengers of the tube train, now cadavers, suffered one final assault of the carefully controlled atmosphere on board the tube train carriage. Flames shoot out from different positions, from hidden nozzles, under the solid metal seats. The cadavers were efficiently incinerated. The nodes were no more. The tube train reached the apex of its proximity to the coast. Valves automatically opened on the coast-facing side of the tube train carriage as a computer controlled the negative pressure, sucking the ash and other debris out, leaving them to fly through the air, plummeting and drifting silently. secretly onto the rugged coastline and rough seas below, efficiently, covertly, eliminating every trace of the nodes, their incinerated clothing and possessions. Finally, disinfectant and water gushed down into the automated carriages, removing every last stain and scent of the now non-existent nodes. All traces of the secret automated mass murder that just unfolded were washed away. Simultaneously, all official records and big data analysis of Mrs. White since her birth that had been stored over the decades on the state's databases were whipped clean. Mrs. White no longer existed. She had officially never existed. She had been a redundant node. As she aged, her crime was to let her essence, her natural instinct and inclinations slowly supersede the utopian state's will. Her individual actions and fallibility had been at constant odds with the statistical quota's expectations. She had been removed from the great statistical model, the utopian state minus Mrs. White. The economic efficiency policy algorithms were recalibrated, no longer running with Mrs. White's presence, or lagged past big data, just as the other nodes on the Arcadian Express that morning were removed from the algorithm. The Arcadian Express ran like clockwork, every day, many times a day. No node ever suspected the truth, and if they did, what could they do, apart from end up on the Arcadian invitation census list? The Ministry of Inference's building comprised of just 9 floors, situated in Mallet Street, central primary sample space, adjacent to the enigmatic, imposing Senate House. I sat at my desk on the 7th floor of the Ministry of Inference's middle floors, reading the newly published official statistical quotas for the following month. Even the National News Channel had published State Utopia's official expected quotas for the following month. The quotas contained the expected population economic aggregate demand and the sigma node caste sample consumption quotas. Yet my attention was vacant as I moved my eyes from side to side pretending to read, whilst I tried to calm my disposition over the concern of Mrs. White's certain demise, which I found deeply concerning. The most sombre statistical quotas were dealt with by the Ministry of Inferences, which included the previous month's stealth confidence interval quotas results, which was my department's responsibility to process. The stealth confidence interval quotas were distributed amongst the middle floor section of the Ministry of Inferences and Processes by the beta node civil servants. These stealth confidence interval quotas were more subtle and differed slightly from the publicly known caste. Specific confidence interval quotas, results that all the endogenous sigma nodes were informed of each month. I browsed through the statistically significant results, searching for newly classified redundant nodes, which I had been tasked to analyze and possibly amend. The monthly redundant node list consisted of nodes that consistently fell outside of the stealth or personal confidence interval region of acceptable conformity. Redundant nodes transgressing the statistical quotas each month accounted for approximately 0.8% of State Utopia's population. The confidence interval was calculated by the Ministry of Inference's statistical algorithms, which were used as a tool to regulate the exact amount of aggregate demand within State Utopia per month, ultimately controlling the node's personal consumption and defining an official spectrum of expected routines allowed by the state, all to ensure the economic efficiency of the State Utopia's economy. The confidence interval was the epitome of a fixed, known, given mean of expected results, even before the result had been realized. Yet each month, The confidence interval mean shifted very slightly to compensate for stochastic, macroeconomic, exogenous shocks to the great population. Linear regression function of the Economic Efficiency Act produced beta. The market price, free of firm and node-specific uncertainty. These confidence interval quota expectations unfortunately caused innocent nodes to be officially categorized as redundant nodes, even though most were respectable complaint nodes that raised families, paid their taxes, and continually thought within the politically correct opinion range, their whole lives. Yet they could be sent a letter of invitation to Arcadia at any month for being slightly outside of the new monthly expected confidence interval consumption routines or implied thought standard deviation. Yet in their countless previous decades acceptable statistical results were irrelevant. Only the current month's results mattered. Ironically, the fixed, known, given, monthly sigma cast, specific means, and its corresponding confidence interval depended on many stochastic variables that determined the monthly shifting of the official mean or the fluctuations of the variances. Stochastic ratios, such as the birth-to-death ratio, and current exogenous shocks to the great beta linear regression model, as well as the alpha node's discretion. I had to deal with these sobering statistical facts every month, making sure these statistics were completely accurate as compliant lives were at stake. Most of the newly classified redundant nodes were innocent law-abiding compliant citizens who merely fell outside of the expected current confidence interval quotas. They were no longer part of the statically insignificant 95% majority. Their crime being statically significant, having a p-value of less than 5. Yet an individual node's performance was partially stochastic, therefore an element of luck may be involved. It was luck for an innocent endogenous node to consistently survive living in a statistical matrix of expected quotas that shifted dynamically and unpredictably each month. What constituted whether an endogenous sigma node was innocent or guilty of the statistical transgression of falling outside of the current fixed, given, known confidence interval quotas, condemning them to the secret category of redundant node. A few fractions of a standard deviation which ironically was influenced by stochastic exogenous shocks. Blue walked past with his newly assigned recruit, which he was tasked to show around the department. The recruit looked too young and naive to have passed the Ministry of Inference's analysts' exams. Yet now he was an official ministry trainee, ready to start work on the middle floors. Blue informed the newly joined recruit, "The state now controls every aspect of the node's life by using different techniques, but mainly with applied statistics and time series econometric algorithms coupled with behavioral psychology." He pointed to a computer terminal. "These algorithms can be understood in layman's terms as partial derivative calculus equations," he said in an official tone. "You were taught at Ministry of Inference's Academy that each node is an economically efficient variable that can be affected directly and indirectly by a small change in an associated node." The new recruit smiled eagerly while nodding his head. It could be an animate node, like a citizen node, or a sub-node, like a pet animal, or an inanimate node such as an embed kettle or new routine such as taking a different tube to work, Blue said, waving his hands around, patronizingly with an air of importance. An infinitesimal change in one of the target node's variables or in an associated node could affect directly or indirectly the actions and thoughts of the target node. By controlling each specific variable in the spectrum of allowed variables within a node's life, we have created a set of partial derivatives, a ratio. This ratio will create a small change within an endogenous variable, and will in turn produce a disproportionate change within the resultant variable's disposition and productivity. By merely changing an associate node's disposition for the day, we can affect the target node's productivity and routines. Microeconomics and behavior analysis all rolled into calculus and applied statistics and time series econometric algorithms. That is the nature of the Economic Efficiency Act, to control aggregate demand from a microeconomic and macroeconomic level. Bottom-up, social engineering for the efficiency of the normalized state. The new recruit thought for a moment, then concluded, so, total, partial, derivative ratio manipulation of a target node affects its probability distribution function with a disproportionate subtle weighting, affecting the node's work routines and other nodes around him. Correct, confirmed Blue in a slightly patronizing manner. His eyes shifted to the right for a split second as he was shocked at the level of insight and articulation of the new recruit. Distributed, lagged variables of difference equations can also be used to guide the node. Each variable of a target node has previous time period values. So by exposing a target node to certain situations or matrices of a particular variable set, we can mold the target node very subtly. When a target node moves from one situation to another, such as moving to a different job or neighborhood, the node will retain a certain percentage of the previous environment and mindset, which influences their new set of experiences. The target node will progress through time, intermittently changing their circumstances, but at each new time interval, previous lagged time period variables are still being carried over to different degrees of weighting, all affecting the node, continued Blue. Whether the ministry is directly or indirectly influencing the target node with infinitesimal changes to their personal utility or productivity whilst using the total partial derivative algorithms, we can also influence the target node through the accumulation of previous distributed lagged variables, which will affect their current routines and behaviors with previous perceptions from their past, without the node even being aware, added Beta, interrupting Blue's speech, showing his enjoyment of stealing Blue's spotlight. Beta enjoyed making new recruits nervous, alluding to the extent of the state's control. Blue glared disapprovingly at Beta, who walked away, smirking. "Wow," said the young new recruit. "That is impressive. They did not teach us the distributed lagged variable algorithm at the academy." "These techniques are only used to catch terrorists," replied Blue, trying to give a look of genuineness. "Yeah, right," mumbled Beta, who was now sitting nearby, typing a report. Blue gave him another glare. Bernoulli looked on. I sensed his stone face expression hid a depressed disdain for the amount of manipulation carried out upon the nodes. Blue became more stressed, as the new recruit was being privy to innuendo regarding information that he would not be cleared to learn of for many years to come. The recruit face had an expression of concern at Beta's innuendo. But he did not want to question these techniques, which he now considered could possibly be used on ordinary nodes as well. And for outliers, added Bavariat, who could not help joining in the fun by walking past Blue and the recruit to add a bit of dark humor, enjoyed seeing Blue embarrassed in front of the new recruit. "Oh, and outliers as well," said Blue, softening the transition from terrorist to outlier node. "You've heard of outliers?" "I did pass the Ministry of Inference exams," replied the recruit with an uncharacteristic sarcasm, letting slip the submissive facade that most recruits feel obliged to perform when training at a new office. "Of course you did," replied Blue, trying to regain his composure, taking charge while trying to calm down the situation. "Well, as you know," fumbled Blue, "an outlier is a node who is reclassified as a redundant node, a statistical transgressor, an economic criminal because they fall outside the Economic Efficient Act confidence interval. It can be a series of emotional, implied thought deviations, or subconscious implied routine deviations, or even financial transgressions, such as having a permanent subpar credit score. Punctuality to work, regularity of bill payments, work productivity, the trend of television programs viewed, travel patterns, and routines of a node. Any reason that a node deviates from a certain degree from the norm or the average, that node is no longer in the Economic Efficiency Act confidence interval. They are no longer normal. They are a deviant, an outlier, a redundant node," said Blue, trying to add emotional conviction to his speech, as if to justify the sentiment. If a node fell outside the confines of what was officially classified as normalized, then the node was no longer a non-stochastic variable. They become stochastic, random, harder to predict, which is undesirable in the economically efficient society. As a node's routines and consumption approached randomness, this led to unpredictability in the cash flow revenues and internal rates of return of the centum corporations and the central bank's balance sheet. Ultimately, it made the monthly and quarterly economic projections unpredictable and therefore undesirable. All because a small, certain percentage of nodes won't remain within the Economic Efficiency Act confidence interval. This added additional risk to the internal rates of return of investments. Therefore, it is better to terminate unpredictable nodes from the economically efficient society, concluded Blue. It's statistically more efficient for our society. Blue quoted the latest catchphrase of the Ministry of Inferences. Blue continued, "A statistical algorithm-driven society can better monitor the nodes who exhibit expected behavior. Expected facial movements, eye movements, blink rate, breathing rate, perspiration rate, heart rate, head movement rate, speech pause rate and frequency, expected tone of voice, expect smile ratio to conversation content, expected emotions, expected brain map activity, expected daily movements and predicted routines, expected intranet usage, expected telephone usage, expected dietary intake, expected conversation duration, expected conversation topic, trend, expected friend and workmate, daily interaction. If the node falls outside of the confidence interval of 95% or more than 1.96 standard deviations of the quota variables mentioned, then that node would be red-flagged and monitored by use at the Ministry of Inferences. They could well be the makings of a persistent economic efficiency confidence interval outlier, an economic criminal, a redundant node, concluded Blue. I listen, whilst pretending to be absorbed by the data upon my computer screen. I knew this was not completely true, as there were two confidence intervals. The stealth confidence interval, which was analyzed by the state, and the visible caste, specific personal confidence interval, which every node was conditioned to be excited about and take pride in. The confidence interval had been transformed into contemporary, computer-generated surreal graphs, providing surreal, almost intangible information about the node's relevant variables, multidimensional patterns, and dynamic shapes and shades of colors. It was the new, trendy, contemporary graphical way of representing information, and the nodes loved it. All the quantitative inferences and analysis, all to achieve statistical control of the population space, of the utopian state, and its nodes within. Yet not primarily by a political control, as there was no official big dictator, but something far worse, something infinitely more ruthless and controlling. Statistical algorithms, the cold, ruthless efficiency of quantitative methodology, root down hierarchies of ministries and corporations, economically efficient ideology, condensing, analyzing, transforming thoughts and ideas about fairness, governance, and the economy into cold, hard numerical representations, devoid of pity or the irrational animal spirit. The great statistical liberation and its economic efficiency philosophy was nurtured by universities throughout the utopian state and the null hypothesis union. Even within Zhou Pingjun and the nodes republic of the harmonious mean union. I knew this but remained silent as Blue continued to school the new recruit. Blue continued, "Are you familiar with the E-graphs?" Without waiting for the recruit's response, Blue continued, "Nodes self-analyze the shades of color of their personal E-graphs for hours, hoping to get darker colors, nearer the middle of their surreal E-graphs. They hoped to have less pasty, almost shadeless colors, nearer the convoluted borders of the graph. I considered that the E-graph were more ominous. It meant that the average unbiased impressionable node could even analyze other nodes' E-graphs, a socio-economic strategy for elevating the near-omnipotent monitoring of the state. I knew the state supported nodes, taking time and pride in their E-graph fashion accessory. It was an ingenious strategy by the state to augment the E-graph as a fashion accessory and status symbol, which was eagerly adopted by the young nodes. The E-graphs were viewed with pride on their embedded keychains. They regarded their E-graph rating as a status symbol, in the same regard as financial credits, or a new personal fashion accessory, or even an electric automobile, which were rare nowadays, as most nodes had been weaned off personal transport and onto efficient public transport. Apparently to save the environment and to control the citizens' movements, who were perpetually constrained not to travel in crowded, busy environments, to be subjected to continual advertisements and travel routes, all at the state's discretion. Blue continued, "The nodes called each other shade or shadeless. This referred to the fact that nodes had fallen out of the confidence intervals that were allowed to be known to them. the visible confidence interval. More subtle and sophisticated graphs presented in a new computer graphic-orientated manner. Surely graphs with different shadings represented different variables and relationships that ultimately allowed the reader to draw inferences about their level of conformity to general, popular, trivial expected boundaries that the average node should adhere to. I carried on my chain of thought. The state propagated a competitive loyalty between nodes, so that nodes would be proud of their different shades of color in their E-graph. The richer the color, the further away it was from the boundary. The boundary was the end of a transformed confidence interval on an average node's E-graph. The E-graph resembling a portion of paint, splattered on the floor with different colors, and shaded overlapping each other mixed. The closer they were to the mean of the public confidence interval, the richer the colors of the E-graph grew. The more average they were, the more proud the nodes felt. It was impossible for all the diligent nodes who tried hard to stay within the boundaries of acceptability on their E-graphs. No matter how hard they tried, some would inevitably fall outside the boundaries, their shades rendered transparent. Blue and the recruit exited the office to view a room filled with database records. Many of the beta node colleagues glanced at each other, letting out a series of sniggers after witnessing Uncle Blue initiate a new recruit into the running of the floor. If only the recruit knew the other half of it. Yet surely he will slowly be exposed to the truth over the next few years. Once he is sufficiently desensitized and indoctrinated, it was all part of the process of turning an innocent recruit into a complicit beat sundry, responsible for the administration of the confidence interval. Beta shouted to Blue and the obliging recruit, "If you work hard, you can even win a ticket to Arcadia." Blue scoured back at Beta, his eyes pleading him not to mention too much to the recruit. The recruit's eyes lit up at the thought of a free trip to the famous Arcadia. A series of further roars echoed from the middle floor as the Beta sundry realized the joke, while the recruit looked perplexed but slightly honored that he may receive a free trip to Arcadia. I understood the joke that Beta had made at the expense of the new recruit, that the Arcadian Express was extremely subtle, seemingly innocuous. It reflected the clever, ruthless, and micro-statistical manner in which the state viewed and dealt with its nodes. Nodes that consistently did not adhere to the stealth confidence interval quotas were classed as confidence interval criminals, outliers, redundant nodes. These redundant nodes persistently produced subpar results, which meant they would be classified as unacceptable, statically significant, standard deviation from the official mean. This negatively affected the statistical harmony of the Economic Efficiency Act. Outliers, stochastic nodes, redundant nodes who fell outside the confidence interval of the utopian state had to be removed from society permanently. Rehabilitation was not cost-effective. Removing the redundant nodes from society would be a costly endeavor. Bundling a known outlier, redundant node into the back of a van to be killed in a concentration camp would be too laborious when faced with the never-ending new collection of redundant nodes each month. There were too many variables. Possible guilt, stricken utopian state kidnappers, and potentially thousands of escapees on the run, spreading stories of mass terminations. Therefore, the Ministry of Inferences had devised a much more refined and cost-effective method of dealing with newly classified, redundant nodes, an infinitely more efficient and subtle level. Unaware outlier nodes were secretly reclassified as redundant nodes and were then sent an official letter, inviting them to report in person to a community hall in Arcadia. When arriving at Arcadia, they should present their official identity documents and answer a few important official questions, an unexpected individual census. Most nodes were aware of the fact that one day they may be summoned to attend the Arcadian census, similar to jury duty. They also knew to keep their invitation a secret for state security reasons. However, the town of Arcadia did not exist. In reality, it only existed in fiction, on all the official utopian state maps, found in government departments and in state school geography books. There were even intermittent, regular, bogus breaking news stories, apparently emanating from Arcadia. Stories such as a flood causing havoc, or a heartbreaking, missing unbiased headline. There was even a popular soap opera on prime-time viewing which was set and supposedly filmed in Arcadia, called simply Arcadia. But in reality, the town did not exist. The exact GPS coordinates of Arcadia was just a collection of vacant farming fields in the county of Cambridge. All the roads and footpaths leading into the area where it was believed that Arcadia existed suddenly stopped. Electric fences and patrolling guards stopped nodes from physically entering the area. Security was increased during the school holiday season, when there were a lot of holiday makers and school unbiased running around the countryside. Conveniently, there was usually some breaking news story about a catastrophe emanating from Arcadia during that time. A breaking news disaster story gave the guards a reason to erect permanent roadblocks and close off extra fences, which they claimed were erected a few hours earlier for the purpose of containing the catastrophe. The irony was that in the collective minds of the nodes, who witnessed each breaking news, focused all their empathy on the poor, suffering residents of Arcadian when actually there was no Arcadia. These continual news stories reinforced in the minds of the nodes that there was actually a place called Arcadia, when in fact there is not, all designed to condition the nodes, so if one of them transgressed the statistical quotas, when they were sent an official letter summoning them to attend the secret census at Arcadia, they felt they were going to a familiar place, a place where they have empathized and identified with. Some binaries even baked cakes to bring with them to give to the poor locals of Arcadia, or excitedly believed they would meet a famous Arcadia soap opera star when attending the census. There were even full-color brochures attached to their official letter, implying that the nodes may even dine with the famous, beautiful stars, their amazing reward for keeping secret the perceived necessary official census. The chartered public tube train traveled to Arcadia direct. The Arcadian Express, also known as the Outlier Express, to the informed minority of Alpha and Beta, Ministry of Inference's civil servants. The redundant nodes were instructed in their invitation letter to report to Platform 7 and to board the only tube train there, the Arcadian Express, but to come alone, early in the morning. There was strict security there due to the current perceived calamity at Arcadia, but it was to just make sure they were the correct nodes, the redundant nodes. The Arcadian Express ran like clockwork every day, sometimes many times a day. No node ever suspected the truth, and if they did, What could they do?